Imagine it's 1944, and delegates from 44 allied nations are gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They're about to make a decision that will reshape the global economy for the next 80 years. Britain, the world's dominant financial power for over 2 centuries, is broke. Their debt stands at 249% of GDP. They're bankrupt from World War II, and everyone in that room knows it. So they do something that's happened only a handful of times in recorded history. They transfer global reserve currency status from one empire to another, from the British pound to the American dollar. What most people don't understand is that this wasn't just a financial decision. It was the recognition of an inevitable pattern that has repeated itself for over 500 years. Every reserve currency in history has followed the exact same life cycle: rise, peak, overextension, collapse, without exception. And right now, the American dollar is showing every warning sign that preceded the collapse of every reserve currency that came before it. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to my Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. Let me take you back to 1450 and show you how this pattern began. The Portuguese real was the world's first true reserve currency, dominating global trade from approximately 1450 to 1530. About 80 years of dominance. Portugal didn't become the reserve currency by accident. They revolutionized global trade by establishing new routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. After Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the traditional spice routes were controlled by hostile powers. Portugal circumvented them entirely by sailing around Africa. The revelation that sea travel was far more efficient than costly land journeys energized Portugal's rise during the Age of Discovery. Lisbon became the pivot point of global trade, and the Portuguese real became the currency everyone needed to conduct international business. At their peak, Portugal created a dominant global empire with military outposts along the coasts of Africa, India, Malaysia, Japan, and even China through Macau. The Portuguese real was accepted from Europe to Asia. But then came the overextension phase. Portugal became overextended, maintaining their vast empire. The military costs of defending outposts on 4 continents drained their treasury. Attacks and competition from the Dutch, British, and French intensified. Then, in the 1530s, Portugal faced a succession crisis that weakened their government internally. By 1580, Spain conquered Portugal to form the Iberian Union. The Portuguese real had dominated for 80 years. Then it was gone, replaced by Spanish silver. The Spanish discovered the richest silver deposit in the world in 1545, a massive mountain at 4,800 meters altitude in the Bolivian Andes at Potosí. This created the first truly global currency of exchange. The pieces of 8, with the mark P for the Potosí Mint established in 1574. During the boom period of 1575 to 1635, Potosí alone produced nearly half the world's silver. At peak production between 1580 and 1630, Potosí produced 81% of all official silver from the Viceroyalty of Peru and up to 60% of global production. The Spanish dollar became the most stable and least debased coin in the Western world from the 16th to the 19th century. It was widely used in Europe, the Americas, and the Far East. The Spanish dollar was even the first legal tender in the United States from independence until 1857. Spain dominated global reserve currency status from the 1530s to the 1640s, about 110 years. But the same pattern emerged: overextension and debt. Charles V left his son Philip II with a debt of about 36 million ducats and an annual deficit of 1 million ducats. Philip II was forced to default on loans in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. The 1557 bankruptcy resulted from overextension of imperial ambitions, dependency on New World silver making the economy vulnerable to fluctuations, and inefficient fiscal policies with inconsistent tax collection. Here's the fatal flaw: the massive influx of gold and silver from the New World caused devastating inflation in Spain. Specie flowing through Spain increased prices fourfold during Philip II's reign, presenting a serious economic problem. Spain's supply of money from the Americas slumped by half during the first 15 years of Philip III's reign, beginning in 1598. The government was forced to declare bankruptcy again in 1607. By 1641, when the Iberian Union fell, the Spanish currency's dominance was finished. The Dutch guilder was rising. Amsterdam became the world's leading financial center in the mid-1600s. The Dutch government channeled money into debt and equity investments. Most importantly, the Dutch East India Company. The Bank of Amsterdam provided an effective, efficient, and trusted system for national and international payments. The Dutch guilder became a de facto reserve currency in Europe throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, accounting for over a third of all international transactions. The Dutch didn't just dominate through trade, they innovated finance itself. They created the world's first stock exchange in Amsterdam, marine insurance companies, and sophisticated financial products including acceptance credit, commission trade, and shares of publicly traded companies. The Dutch produced roughly 25% of global inventions in the early 17th century, especially in shipbuilding. The Dutch guilder dominated from 1642 to 1720, about 78 years, but the pattern repeated. Military overextension led to financial collapse. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War from 1780 to 1784 was won decisively by the British both financially and militarily. This bankrupted the Dutch and caused Dutch debt, Dutch equities, the guilder, and the Dutch Empire to collapse. In the late 18th century, the Dutch East India Company faced a financial crisis caused mainly by its wars against the British Empire in Asia. The result was bankruptcy. By the late 1700s, the British pound sterling was emerging as the new reserve currency, backed by Britain's industrial prowess and expansive colonial holdings. The British pound sterling would dominate for approximately 220 years, from the 1720s to 1944, making it the longest-lasting reserve currency in modern history. At its peak, over 60% of world trade was invoiced in pound sterling. London was the world center for insurance and commodity markets. British capital was the leading source of foreign investment around the world. The establishment of the gold standard solidified the pound's position. The Great Recoinage of 1816 attempted to restabilize Britain's currency after the economic difficulties of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. By 1922, the British Empire held power over 458 million people, one-fifth of the world's population, and about a quarter of the total land area at the time. Britain's dominance seemed permanent, unshakable, but the same pattern was already developing. During World War I, British national debt increased from £650 million in 1914 to £7.7 billion in 1919. The war was catastrophically expensive. World War II was even worse. Shortly after the war ended, UK government debt peaked at around 270% of GDP, an all-time high of 249% at war's end. Britain was broke. Despite being on the winning side of both world wars, the financial cost had destroyed their ability to maintain their empire or their reserve currency status. This brings us back to Bretton Woods in 1944. 730 delegates from all 44 Allied countries gathered from July 1st to 22nd to create the International Monetary Fund and International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The Bretton Woods system required countries to guarantee convertibility of their currencies into US dollars to within 1% of fixed parity rates, with the dollar convertible to gold bullion for foreign governments and central banks at $35 per troy ounce. The transition from pound to dollar was formalized. The United States dollar became the new global reserve currency. The Bretton Woods system lasted until 1971, with currencies becoming fully convertible in 1958. Countries settled international balances in dollars convertible to gold at the fixed exchange rate of $35 per ounce. But on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. The gold standard was finished. The dollar didn't collapse, though. Instead, it found a new foundation: oil. Following the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, the US reached a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would price and sell their oil exclusively in US dollars in return for military protection. By 1975, all OPEC members agreed to trade oil in US dollars. The petrodollar system was born. Every country that needed oil, which was every country, needed dollars. This created artificial global demand for US currency and allowed America to run deficits that would have destroyed any other nation's currency. For the next 50 years, dollar dominance seemed unquestionable. At its peak in 2000, the dollar represented over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. But the pattern is emerging again. As of 2024, the dollar represented 57.8% of global foreign exchange reserves. That's down from over 70% in 2000. Foreign investors' share of treasury ownership has fallen to 30% as of early 2025, down from a peak above 50% during the global financial crisis. The de-dollarization trend is accelerating. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and UAE, are actively building alternatives to the dollar system. As of 2025, there are 10 BRICS member nations, with 13 additional nations signed on as partner countries. The BRICS bridge payment system would connect member countries' financial systems using payment gateways for settlements and central bank digital currencies. And here's where America's situation becomes critical. As of March 6, 2025, U.S. debt held by the public was $29 trillion, and intragovernmental holdings were $7.4 trillion, for a total of $36.4 trillion. U.S. government debt accounted for 124% of the country's nominal GDP in December 2024. Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, and Britain all followed the same pattern. Each lasted between 78 and 220 years, with an average of about 95 years. The US dollar has been the reserve currency for 81 years since Bretton Woods. We're approaching the historical average lifespan. Let me show you the four-stage life cycle that every reserve currency has followed. Stage 1. Rise. A nation establishes trade dominance and naval or military power. They innovate in finance, shipping, or technology. Their currency becomes essential for international commerce. Portugal did this with new trade routes. Spain did it with Potosi silver. The Dutch did it with financial innovation. Britain did it with industrial revolution and empire. America did it with post-World War II economic dominance. Stage 2. Peak, maximum global influence and currency acceptance. The reserve currency is used for 60 to 70% or more of international transactions. The nation seems invincible. Each empire had this moment. Portugal controlling the spice trade, Spain with half the world's silver, Dutch with a third of all transactions, Britain invoicing 60% of world trade, America with 70% of reserves in 2000. Stage 3. Overextension, excessive military spending and debt accumulation. The costs of maintaining global dominance exceed the economic benefits. Debt to GDP ratios spike. Portugal overextended across 4 continents. Spain's debt forced multiple defaults. The Dutch bankrupted themselves fighting Britain. Britain's WWI and WBI's current debts hit 270% of GDP. America's debt is currently 124% of GDP, with $8 trillion spent on Middle East wars alone. Stage 4. Collapse, currency crisis, and transition to new power. The reserve currency loses status. A new dominant power emerges. Every transition has brought financial market turmoil and uncertainty. The shift from one country's decline to another's rise marks radical transformation. So what happened to these nations after they lost reserve currency status? Portugal never recovered its former glory. After the 1530s crisis and Spanish conquest, Portugal became a secondary European power. Their empire gradually dissolved, and they never regained financial dominance. Spain faced centuries of decline after repeated bankruptcies. Despite controlling vast New World resources, inflation and debt destroyed their economy. By the 1800s, Spain was a minor power struggling with internal instability. The Netherlands remained prosperous, but never regained reserve currency status. After the 1780s collapse, they became a regional rather than global power. The Dutch maintained high living standards but lost their position at the center of global finance. Britain's decline offers the clearest warning. Over 30 years from 1946, the UK debt to GDP ratio fell from 270% to around 50% through sustained economic growth. But this came at enormous cost. Britain was forced to liquidate overseas assets, grant independence to colonies, and accept a dramatically reduced role in global affairs. In the 1950s, 55% of global reserves were still held in sterling. Within 20 years, that share had dropped by 10% and continued falling. The pound's decline took place gradually, with markets adjusting accordingly. Britain went from controlling a quarter of the world's territory to becoming a mid-sized European economy. The British century was over, replaced by the American century. The transition took many years after the United States overtook the United Kingdom economically, before the dollar overtook the pound as the dominant reserve currency. These transitions don't happen overnight, but they do happen. Here's what the historical pattern tells us about America's current position. Every reserve currency has averaged about 95 years of dominance, with a variance of about 10 years. Portugal lasted 80 years, Spain lasted 111 years, Netherlands lasted 78 years. Britain lasted about 220 years, as an outlier. The US dollar has been the reserve currency for 81 years since Bretton Woods. We're right in the middle of the historical range. Every reserve currency declined due to an oversaturation point. The US currently maintains 900 military bases in 130 countries, a level of overextension that matches or exceeds any previous empire. Every reserve currency faced a debt crisis before collapse. US debt at 124% of GDP is approaching the levels that preceded British decline, though not yet at the 270% peak Britain reached. Every reserve currency lost status when a more dynamic economy emerged. Just as the US overtook Britain economically before the dollar overtook the pound, China is now challenging US economic dominance. The warning signs are everywhere. Declining reserve share from 70% to 58%. Foreign creditors reducing treasury holdings from 50% to 30%. BRICS nations building alternative payment systems. Petrodollar agreements ending. Military overextension draining resources. The pattern that has repeated for 500 years is playing out again. The only question is timing. And will the transition be gradual like Britain's decline over decades? Or rapid like the Dutch collapse after military defeat? Will there be a single successor like previous transitions? Or a multipolar system with multiple reserve currencies? What we know from history is this: no reserve currency lasts forever. The average is 95 years. The pattern is consistent: rise, peak, overextension, collapse. And those who ignore the pattern are doomed to repeat it. Thank you for watching my Money Mint. If you have a topic you'd like me to make a video about, please leave it in the comments below.